where we see, and children cover your ears, but apparently a Merrill gold trader chat exposed how he fucks the market around a lot, how easy it is to manipulate the metals markets. I wonder if that has any connection of how we see silver here sitting at 25 bucks. Well, hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics on a rather exciting day in the world. I'm not sure if everybody is aware of some of the things that have been happening, but fortunately, I'm joined by Greg Crowe of Silver One to dig into a lot of the fascinating events in the silver market, but also around the globe, where over this past weekend, we saw some unprecedented events, which maybe have not yet directly been linked to the silver market, although I think they are all connected. So with that said, Greg, it's a pleasure to welcome you on back in here. And I think people really enjoyed seeing you on the show last time. So great to see you here. How's everything going today?
Good, Chris, and thanks a lot for having me on again. Always an interesting conversation with you. I never know where it's headed, so I'll let you just start the conversation.
Well, we'll keep you on your toes. Although, again, right off the bat, one of the things I appreciate, Greg, I think, as you're pointing out, when you come on here, there's no list of pre-planned questions. You never said, don't ask me about this, don't ask me about that, which is different than a lot of the Wall Street silver community, where we see bizarre things happen that people don't usually talk about until sometimes it comes out in court, where we see, and children cover your ears, but apparently a Merrill gold trader chat exposed how he fucks the market around a lot, how easy it is to manipulate the metals markets. I wonder if that has any connection of how we see silver here sitting at 25 bucks. Of course, this is in the midst of inflation prints, 4.7%, 5%. Greg, I would suggest that 10, 20, 30 years ago, if someone had told you you would have the chance to be running a silver company in an environment where we're seeing 5% plus inflation prints. I mean, I thought 2% was a lot, even if the Fed has a mandate there. But now we're in 5% territory. Silver's 25 bucks. We're finding out in the courtrooms there's a reason why it's 25 bucks. Obviously, leaves a lot of questions, but that's what we try and answer here. So I know you're talking to investors about silver all day. What would you say about all of that, and where are we at this point?
Yeah, no, always interesting stories that come out, but just keep it in mind that sometimes the media likes to play things up in one manner or another. What fiat currency is not manipulated in one manner or another? A lot of these things are, but that Deutsche Bank manipulation, that certainly made the headlines, and it does show that it is easy. But these things eventually become exposed. Silver, as you mentioned, is trading at $25 an ounce. Just over a year ago, it was trading at $12, $13 an ounce. So it hasn't had that big an issue with respect to increasing silver prices. Could they be higher? Yes, potentially. One thing that happens around the world with respect to manipulation, governments also manipulate precious metal prices. They want to protect their fiat currencies. And if they feel it's important that they increase their value of their particular fiat currency at any time, and they have the ability to do so, and in particular, you might want to talk about the US, which has one of the world's strongest economy, then we see precious metal prices go down accordingly if that dollar goes up. But the dollar's been struggling in the 89 to 92 range on the US dollar index. I mean, back in the the height of COVID, back in March of 2020, it was at 126, and silver prices were at $12, $13. Now it's down to 92 today, I think, or 93, but it's off a little bit. We're seeing silver marginally higher today. back over $25, and it's consistently trading in the $25 to $28 range. I think that's very good.
So, I mean, we see the US dollar index here been floating around, reached 100 here in that range, like you said, 90 to 95, yet we're in the face of unprecedented global money printing. We also have a Fed meeting coming up this Wednesday. I get it that this is how Wall Street trades and this does impact the markets, but has there ever been a time where if you could take a step back and realize this is all inherently silly, we don't know when it's going to be resolved, but to me it seems like a matter of when rather than if in silver. And if someone can get to the point where they feel comfortable knowing that, I think that could be the single most valuable piece of insight in the entire financial markets right now. Would you agree?
Sure, and I'm a bull on silver, of course, and I am the CEO of a silver company, and but why do I feel the strength of silver, particularly down the road? Well, I think this whole idea of this printing of unprecedented printing of money, not only by the U.S. but a lot of other countries. We've got unprecedented debt levels that are going to have to be dealt with. We've got questions of the U.S. currency. What is the future of the U.S. currency? We're seeing things like Bitcoin, which has been struggling lately as well as a competitor. We're seeing groups like Tesla, etc. Now Amazon talking about using Bitcoin as currency for buying of their products. We still have inflationary fears. You talked about 5%, but that's up and down. What's going to happen with inflation as the economy opens up and we get over this COVID pandemic, which is still out there. But once we get over that, I think there's going to be a massive purchasing event taking place worldwide, and that's going to lead to inflation. You're going to see increased employment and eventually a growth in economies. And once that takes place, let's talk about silver. What happens with silver? And one of the reasons I like silver more than I like gold, although I do like gold, but the reason I like it more than I like gold is because not only is it an investment, it is also an industrial mineral. And it not only performs well in times of uncertainty and fear, but it also can perform very well in times of economic growth. And what are the big engines of growth down the road? Well, those happen to be things like the electronics industry, electric vehicles, solar panels are taking off around the world as there's more and more fear out there with respect to the climate situation. So fossil fuels going down, even China is, projecting a decrease in fossil fuel consumption, although they do seem to be still very dependent on fossil fuels, but they're talking about an increase in things like solar, wind, etc. So all these components, silver is used in everything. It's also used in all the electronic circuits you see in a lot of the goods that we use, cell phones, computers. It's used in simple things like silverware. It's used in mirrors. Almost 26% of the usage of silver is just in those basic commodities. We use it in every day. So I like silver. And if you look at a precious metals bull market, silver outperforms gold quite substantially in those upturned markets. And whether we believe it or not, we've seen some very significant investment houses talk about the beginning of a 10-year commodity super cycle, and precious metals will be part of that, in particular silver.
Yeah, and Greg, I'm not sure if you're referring to JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon, who said that he doesn't think inflation is going to be transitory at all. It's interesting. He said that in response, they're actually holding cash, which seems somewhat counterintuitive to me, because if you're concerned about inflation because there's so much cash being printed, probably might not want to hold the asset that's being devalued. And I would think that would be a great reason for silver. Although speaking of other reasons for silver, you mentioned uncertainty. Certainly plenty of that going around in the world. And as someone who sits here, I have these weird hobbies. I read books about the Hunt brothers and what actually happened in 1980, often very different from what we were told. And one of the key events was actually back then when, you had a lot of uncertainty in the world. The US embassy in Iran was stormed and they had some hostages there. And that was right before silver hit 50, which, at least from my research of what happened with the Hunt brothers and the timing, was at least some factor. Keep in mind, gold also hit a high at the same time, and the Hunt brothers weren't buying gold. And here over the weekend, we saw, especially in Australia, but other places around the globe, people outside protesting government policies. And here, another coup. Violent protests erupt in Tunisia as president suspends parliament. We saw people storming the Lebanese central bank. What would you say about this? To me, it feels like, in the same way silver has some forces that have been stuffed underwater and that are going to have to pop eventually, it almost feels like a political and social version of this is beginning to play out on a bigger and bigger scale. And again, when I see these things, maybe I'm a little biased, but it reminds me of what happened 1979 before silver hit $50. Curious if you have any thoughts on any of that.
World events certainly do add to, shall we say, uncertainty and fear. I mean, not only do we have these instances taking place in, I'll call it a smaller country like Tunisia, which, doesn't really play big on everybody's radar, but a little more. We're seeing China becoming much more vocal about its place in the world. We're seeing movements to build islands in the South China Sea. We're seeing talk of Taiwan essentially being reunited with China, and the US coming up and saying, well, we will defend Taiwan. We're seeing people in protesting the Japanese Olympics out of China because they had dared to mention the words or show a map that had actually Taiwan as a separate country. These are very turbulent times, and all we need is a spark. We've seen these sparks happen in the past, and in economic uncertain times, they can be far worse. So yeah, there are things to fear out there, and I'm hoping that these events don't come to pass, but I still think we have a strong argument as to whether or not these types of events come to pass. We still have good rationale for an increasing silver price just through growth, future growth in the economies, and inflationary fears, etc.
I think so. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but I actually find it hard. In fact, it's funny as I think about it now. I mean, usually when you do a show talking about anything as opinionated as I do, there's someone who tells you you're nuts. I very rarely even, I don't even remember the last time someone says I'm a conspiracy theorist every once in a while, but I don't ever remember anyone even attempting to explain what I'm missing in silver, how there's a counter argument to silver having a good profile. Although, Greg, you mentioned a couple of things going on Far East. Now, Japan, they could be protesting the Olympics. I don't know if maybe they were upset because they're protesting Shinzo Abe's hyperinflation campaign that he used as his platform about 7 years ago to get elected, and then actually did deliver on. Although, Greg, you mentioned China as well, and I had this pulled up from this morning. Doesn't seem like the relationship there. I don't get the sense that Xi Jinping and Joe Biden are going to be coming to Silverfest 2 in October and joining us for Silver Jeopardy in the pool. Seems like things are not ideal here, as China blasts U.S., seeing it as imaginary enemy, leading to the stalemate. and gave Biden a to-do list. Now, Greg, at least the coverage I've seen of U.S. and China, I'm guessing the Biden administration isn't like looking at that to-do list and be like, hey, let's check these off. We can please the Chinese by lunchtime. We got 60% of it done. Doesn't seem like an ideal global economic situation, but any thoughts on China blasting U.S. as an imaginary enemy?
Well, that's not new. That's been there for a while. And I would say probably, with current leader in China, that's been part of the issue with respect to increasing Chinese dominance around the world. We saw it under the Trump administration, a lot of, essentially sanctions put on some of the Chinese industries, etc. And that tiff started, and it seems to be intensifying. But China is now an economic powerhouse, and it's not quite as transparent as what we see in the US. So do we really know what's going on behind the scenes in China? At least in the US, we see things leak out through the media, etc. So we get a sense, maybe not immediately, but we do get a sense of what's going on behind the scenes. So who knows what's going to happen down the road. But the other big bugaboo, I guess, on a global scale is Russia. Russia is also asserting its power. And right now, Russia is having its issues economically. It's having its issues with COVID, but they are also under a strong dictatorial leader that wants to reassert its influence to the collapse of the Soviet days. And we saw that with the incursions into Crimea, eastern Ukraine, Georgia a couple of years before that. And is it going to stop? Don't know. Now we see the US backing out of Afghanistan, and we see the Taliban moving in and taking big control of huge chunks of Afghanistan. What's that going to do to destabilize these parts of the world, which were only pseudo-stabilized with strong military US presence? So, big questions.
Greg, I certainly would agree those are unanswered questions that Wall Street and Ben Bernanke and his friends like Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen have not answered. But if you're going to go all Russia on me, I would ask you, sir, what would you say here, Russia Finance Ministry? This was just earlier this month on July 5th. Russian Finance Ministry to buy $4 billion worth of gold. Said Monday would buy 13.5 billion rubles worth of foreign currency a day, an increase in the amount of daily operations from the previous month. Should we listen to what politicians say, or is it perhaps more insightful to look at the money flows? I mean, there's that old saying, follow the money and you'll see what's going on. What
Sure.
would you say about that?
Yeah, I think you should listen to what the politicians say, but only in terms of weighing it against what is really happening fiscally, so that you can judge, do I give this politician credit or not down the road? But it's always good to listen to what they say, because there is a certain portion of the public that will adhere to what those politicians say, and they can really essentially direct, shall we say, policies throughout the world. And whether we like it or not, we've seen big changes between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Regardless of what they're saying, we've seen big changes. And are those dictated by global events? Are they partially dictated by individual government events? I'd say it's a combination of the two. And so you got to pay attention and listen to both sides of the story. You weigh it as to which way things are going. But I agree with you, a little more credence on where's the money, where's it going? Not only did Russia increase its gold supplies, what did they do with silver? Silver doesn't get mentioned but I'm sure they're buying silver as well. Interesting enough, Brazil just increased its gold into the central bank as well. So there are other countries around the world that are purchasing a lot of gold.
Yeah, Greg, some great things you mentioned there, because especially first with the politicians, helps to have the decoder ring, which is what we try to offer here on Arcadia Economics. Great reason to hit the subscribe button and notification bell, or even just share this episode with Greg if you're finding it helpful. But I mean, there are sometimes some occasions where you can count on politicians telling the truth. I mean, Vladimir Putin, he basically says the dollar's a Ponzi scheme. He called the Rothschild dollar, said he doesn't want any part of it. He backs it up with his actions. When, as mentioned before, when Shinzo Abe promised a hyperinflation campaign, he delivered. And I do believe Joe Biden and any American politician that when they talk about making sure that they're going to spend and print a lot of money, I think they're going to deliver that. So there are some things that you can count on there. Although, Greg, yes, now I remember you touched on something else that I've been asking about. Never seen anything conclusive or substantial, but if these central banks are buying gold for obvious reasons, doesn't there have to be some central bank out there that if all these guys have been able to come to the thought process, okay, money printing, US can't ever pay it back, we see what's going on, the Ponzi scheme's getting bigger, we're going to buy gold. Isn't there someone in one of these central banks, maybe Russia, that has to be aware of silver? Because if you like gold for those reasons, I'm flummoxed how someone couldn't like silver. I've never heard substantially or conclusively of a central bank buying silver, yet just intuitively I wondered, doesn't that have to at least be in the conversation somewhere on the globe?
Sure. They talk a lot about silver ingots in the big vaults in London with the various groups, be it JP Morgan, et cetera, but I'm sure some of the central banks also have it. Not necessarily in London, but we talk about some of the banks in Germany. And I'm sure you're right. And the US government has silver in its vaults as well. I don't know the exact amount, and it's hard getting those figures out of the media. Maybe somebody like yourself can dig a little bit and get some of those statistics, because I'd be interested in hearing about them as well. But I don't have access to that data myself. But yes, indeed, I think they do store silver as well, because silver is a good, as I said, hedge against extraordinary inflation. It's a good hedge in times of uncertainty. But not only that, if you have an industrial complex which is dependent upon the electronics industry, and curious, I wonder whether Mr. Tesla has silver in its inventory as well, because quite a bit of that silver is used in the construction of electric cars. So who knows? I don't have those figures.
Well, that's fair enough. Although perhaps here's another one we could dig into, because I understand American politicians, they're not so much into the gold and silver thing, despite the dollar actually being designed as a measure of gold and silver.
But let me just end by saying that nobody really understands gold price.
Especially when you have someone like the former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke issue a perplexing statement like,
by saying that nobody really understands gold prices, and I don't pretend to really understand them either.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
I think my favorite part about that clip is how they all giggle as if that's actually funny, that this man who's in charge of the world's reserve, was in charge of the world's reserve currency, has no clue about that. Mm-hmm. But Greg, do you find any connection? That was probably almost 10 years ago. And here, interestingly enough, an article out of all places, the Wall Street Journal, suggesting that too much money could portend high inflation. I'm not sure what flying saucer this guy fell out of to come to such a ridiculous conclusion, because as you can see here, on February 23rd, current Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said, the growth in money supply, specifically M2, it just doesn't really have any important implications, because reporting about U.S. inflation rarely even contains the word money supply. Now, I might add that in that same article, they talk about June inflation up 5.4% from a year ago. Now, Jerome Powell has called that transitory, but this was from a year ago, which means a year, which doesn't seem very transitory. But I wonder, Bernanke doesn't understand gold. Jerome Powell thinks there's no connection between hyperinflating the currency and inflation. What would you say about that, Greg?
Um, I'd like some of the drugs they're using. What can I say? I think there's a direct relationship between.
Greg, you don't want to get hooked on that central banking smack. It's not good shit.
No, I mean, but all of the dollars that are being pumped into the economy. I mean, we saw it happen in 2008, and there was a strong rebound in the economies post that. Didn't result in high inflation, but it paled in comparison with the amount of stimulus dollars that are being injected in the economy. I mean, we're talking, I don't know how many trillions we want to talk about, but worldwide, it's probably in excess of 15-20 trillion dollars is my guesstimate. And that's a lot of money. When you considered, the entire, how many decades did it take to get a $20 trillion debt level in the US government alone? And suddenly we're getting this within a year and a half. I can't see how it cannot lead to issues with respect to inflation down the road. Now, mind you, plus 5 point some odd percent inflation from a year ago when it was negative inflation isn't quite there yet. I think the big inflation is yet to come. You want to go back to the 70s. That was a time of huge inflation that transcended into inflation up to 18% in the 1980s. And we saw silver prices there spike to the high $40 level. After 2008, we saw commodities take off. 2010 to 2012 with silver going over $50 per ounce. And just within the last year, we've seen silver march up from a low of $12.50 to a high of $29 and then backing off to 25, 26. I think we're on the cusp of something very intriguing. One thing you might want to think about as well is a lot of talk about, can the Dow sustain the extraordinary levels that it's trading at? Historically, we would all say no. If there is a crash in the Dow, where does all that money go to? I think a lot of people are going to flee into gold and silver.
Yeah, and I would imagine that would probably even be accelerated if anyone in the public had any idea about how some of these supply and demand numbers are stacking up. Because, Greg, at least according to the Silver Institute, which I take with a grain of salt, but they're showing about 1 billion ounces of supply. Here's the total demand. If you net out physical demand and ETFs, basically it's been somewhere about 600 to 800 million ounces for industry. So over the past 10 years, while the investment demand was less than the balance, if there's 300 left over, investment demand is 100, you're good to go. But I don't think it was an accident that the price finally moved last year, because you see here, they're starting to run deficits now. There was a big one last year. I had Keith Neumeyer on last week talking about how the numbers he looks at, and he thinks we've been in a deficit for 3 years.
I'd say 4 years, but okay.
4
Deficit
years.
for 4 years. And the projected increase in the consumption of silver moving forward suggests that we will indeed be in a bigger deficit. Now, let's talk about deficits and supply. Well, what's leading to potential deficits? Well, first of all, a couple of things. A lot of mines out there were struggling, particularly during COVID. It's difficult to find new silver mines. Silver is predominantly actually a byproduct from the production of things like copper, lead, zinc, and gold mines as well. Pure silver mines are rare, and We fortunately have one at Silver One, although we are finding other elements deeper, which is intriguing. But what's happening on the supply side? I mean, on the demand side, we're seeing potential increases in the usages of silver. As I mentioned earlier, the electronics industry, electric cars, solar panels, and all the other commodities that everybody wants to use, because silver is essentially a huge component in the cell phone, in the computer, and other industries that we are all reliant on to be able to function on a day-to-day basis. So where is that demand coming? They're talking about an additional 600 million ounces of silver in the electronic vehicle area alone in the next 10 years. That's on top of what's already being used. And where are the new mines coming from? We're seeing governments come in, putting in new onerous royalties and taxes. Look at the recent elections in the big copper producing country of Chile and one of the largest silver producing companies in Peru. Socialist governments have come into play, and they're talking about taxing the mining industry. What does that do with respect to incentives to go in and explore and find new mines? Not very good.
No, it's not. And Greg, that makes you a bit of a unicorn because you're one of the few people that is navigating these challenges and going out and getting silver exposure. And in terms of folks that see what's going on, everything that things that we've talked about in this call makes sense, and they're looking for leverage on the move. You are one of the companies that offers that. And could you give folks an update on where things stand so that if they are looking for silver stocks, they know what you guys are offering?
Sure. I think first and foremost, I think people out there need to know that Silver One is a company that is focusing in the Southwest US. We are operating in what the Fraser Institute has described as the best and the second best mining jurisdictions in the world, that being Nevada and Arizona. That said, we've been able to secure 100% interest in a past producing silver mine called Candelaria. It produced about 68 million ounces of silver. Kinross was the last big producer, and we've been working on it for the last 4 years since we acquired it. And we have been doing big drill programs. We're looking at rehabilitating some of the old heap leach pads, which still have a significant amount of silver in it. And we've recently been doing some drilling. We're finding some very high grade mineralization down dip from the old pits. And we are piecing that together. And we want to put out an economic report on potentially mixing some of the near surface open pitable material with the heap leach pads and putting out an economic report by the end of the year. But that said, this is almost like a pure silver play. Everything there was silver oxide in terms of past production. But we're finding interesting things down deep at Candelaria. We're finding that there's a component at depth that has gold and copper values that was never previously recognized. So the Candelaria story itself is getting more and more interesting. The other situation that we have is we have two other excellent projects, one in eastern Nevada, one in Arizona. One in Arizona has, in essence, extraordinarily high grade silver nuggets were found on surface. Like they haven't come very far from their spinning values up to 459,000 grams per ton silver from those nuggets, whereas a lot of underground mines in Mexico and other places of the world are producing in the 200 to 500 gram per ton range. So there's quite a discrepancy there. If we can find the source of that mineralization, essentially that would be unprecedented. The only other place in the world that I know of that has produced in large scale at similar type of mineralization is a camp called the Cobalt Silver Camp in northern Ontario, Canada, and that produced anywhere between 500 and 700 million ounces of silver with silver grades similar to what we're finding on our Arizona project. We do have a drill permit working its way through the government. Once we get that permit, we're going to go drill and see if we can find a source. Got another great project in eastern Nevada, and we're going to be moving a drill in there in the not too distant future. So we're plugging away, and we are advancing these very good silver assets that we've been very fortunate in acquiring.
Yeah, and Greg, you mentioned in there about how Kinross used to have the property. I know you've talked about this on the show before, but for anyone maybe hearing for the first time, I know it's a question that often comes up. What is it that they let the project, why did they let the project go? What are you seeing differently that you can do that they were not able to?
Sure. They operated up until 1997. And for those familiar or can at least do a little research back to what was happening at the time, prior to that, we had a big run up in Southeast Asian, what were called tiger companies, and we saw commodities rise substantially. And everybody who was mining was making a lot of money. There was a total collapse in 1997, and silver prices plunged down. They hit about $2.50 per ounce. And Kinross made the decision to essentially shutter the mine. They sold it off to Silver Standard in 2002. Silver Standard did a drill program, outlined a sizable new resource. They did some economic studies, but silver prices were still languishing under $5 per ounce. And Silver Standard made the decision that to move on to other projects. They essentially started producing from some other projects. They started focusing more on gold, so that when we approached them in late 16, early 2017, they essentially were totally rebranding their company. They were becoming a gold mining company. They were starting to sell off some of their silver assets, and we got a great deal on the project. And they actually changed their name to SSR Mining to get silver out of their name. So we just had an opportunity that we walked into. Timing is everything. Timing, luck plays a little bit too.
Yeah, although I find that luck thing sometimes goes in your favor a bit when you've done your underlying preparation and put
Sure.
all the foundation in place. So, Greg, last one for you. I mean, we talked about why I'm of the school of thought that silver is going to have to go higher at some point. When we get to that day where silver is $50 or some number higher of that, for people who are already shareholders of Silver One or thinking about being shareholders, when we get the day where there's a higher silver price, what needs to happen on a company level between now and then to make sure that you're capturing that? And when we have $50 plus silver, anyone who was associated with Silver One came out ahead. What specifically do folks want to watch and see you do so that when we get to that point, everything has gone well?
Okay, so right now we're advancing Candelaria as our flagship project. It's probably, right now anyway, the nearest term to a potential production scenario. We want to put out an economic study by the end of this year. With that economic study, we will seriously look at what's the silver price, is it economic to bring it into production? We've already had discussions with both the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, and the Nevada Department of Environmental Protection, two of the key agencies that are going to be able to say to us whether or not we can move ahead with a production scenario. We've got water on site, we've got power on site, we've got great infrastructure, and based on the conversations we've had with those two big organizations, we have a disturbed site that was never fully reclaimed with all of the permits from Kinross still in place. They told us those permits will need to be updated, but it would be a matter of months, not years, to update those permits. So we're very optimistic that should silver prices start going up significantly in the next year or 2 or 3, however long it takes, we'll be in a position where we can make a decision very rapidly.
Well, I appreciate that. Certainly makes me feel good. If the government keeps printing money and you follow through with what you've been saying as you've come on my show for almost 2 years now.
January of 2020 is when we first.
Yeah, that was 2020. So a year and a half, coming to 2 years. And anyway, Greg, for people who have questions, want to get more in-depth answers or follow up on any of these things, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Best way is to, can you let me share the screen for a second?
Sure, although I have your contact page up, but I will give you.
Oh, there it is. That's it, right? Well, that's the, yeah, okay. There it is there. Best thing to do is email Gary at stratastar.com. And Gary is our investor relations guy. He also works for another company. That's why he doesn't have silverone.com. Or you can contact us through info@silverone.com, or you can email me directly at www.ggcrowe or ggcrowe@silverone.com. Sorry.
All right.
2 G's at the front. 2 G's at the front.
Well, I sure appreciate that. GG Crowe with an E at the end at silverone.com, or mi amigo Gary Lindsey. And Greg, with that said, I thank you as always for stopping by. I know it's, that's what we try and help with, because I get it. It's a challenging time. People are seeing things that don't make sense. And, a lot of the people that we've counted on to be helping or tell us the truth maybe don't always do that. But that's one of the things, again, that I really appreciate about the silver industry. There's people that put their name on it, put their face on it, come and talk about it, let people ask questions. You're one of them. And I think it's really going to be exciting to see your success, not just as a company builder, but as a leader, of someone who saw it was coming before anybody else wanted to talk about it, and put your money behind it, put your career behind it. And it's been a pleasure getting to know you, and look forward to checking in. I mean, who knows what next month's inflation print will be? Maybe we'll hit 6%, and we'll have to get you back on here to help calculate the one following that.
Okay, Chris, and maybe we'll get to see you in October.
Well, I'll sure be hoping so. And thanks again for stopping by today, Greg.
Thanks, Chris. You take care.